Hey everyone, today my guest is Dr. Lydia McGrew, and we're going to be discussing the Gospel of John and her new book, Eye of the Beholder. Let me get it on the camera here. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, the book on the historicity of John. And you can pick it up in the link that I'll put in the description, but basically Amazon and anywhere else where you would order books online. Just a very quick bio on Dr. McGrew. Dr. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytic philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt in 1995. She published extensively, or has published extensively, in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in her books Hidden in Plain View, which you also need to get if you don't have it already, and The Mirror and the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And most recently, this book that we're going to be talking about today, Defending the Gospel of John. And so, Lydia, I'm going to just kind of pepper you with some questions, a lot of objections really to John's Gospel, maybe a little bit different than some of the other interviews that you've done. But I've made videos on my channel defending the authorship of John, the reliability of John. I've definitely gleaned a lot of good stuff from your materials. And I get comments, questions, and, objections. So I'm just going to throw some of those your way. And there's definitely going to be a lot of overlap with the material that's in the book. So
sounds good.
All right. So starting off, I'm going to read a quote to you from the late Bishop John Shelby Spong, everybody's favorite, some liberals' favorite, I guess. But he says that the Gospel of John is so different than the Synoptics, and that it's not meant to be taken as literal history. And he says, just to quote, John's Gospel seems to ridicule anyone who might read this book as a work of literal history. For example, Jesus says to Nicodemus, you must be born again. Nicodemus, the literalist, says, born again? I'm a grown man. How could I crawl back into my mother's womb and be born again? And then when he's talking to the Samaritan woman, Spong says, quoting Jesus, if you knew the gift of God and who it was that was saying, you give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And the Samaritan woman, being a literalist, says, you don't even have a bucket. And so he's basically saying that it's just like historical fiction, and anybody who's paying attention, he's dropping these little clues that like, this isn't meant to be taken literally, guys. And so what do you make of an objection like that?
Well, I think we need to recognize right up front that that's question begging, that so-called argument is question begging. John presents himself as recording cryptic and metaphoric things, yes, that Jesus as a teacher said to people in real historical contexts. And he places these, very specifically, like at Mount Gerizim, for example, where he was talking to the woman at the well. They were right there. And then Spong is assuming that it's a work of literature, and that then we need to kind of look in it for little postmodern clues on it's not really being intended to be taken literally. This would make it actually impossible for someone using Spong's reasoning to know if there really was this teacher who lived 2,000 years ago, who spoke at times metaphorically, and whom other people sometimes misunderstood and took literally when he was speaking metaphorically. There's nothing particularly implausible about that. You can imagine a Confucian sage or something speaking metaphorically and being taken literally by a person he's having a conversation with. So if you approach any such reported conversation and say, that's a clue, this isn't meant to be taken literally, then you could never know if a person like Jesus, a teacher like Jesus, had such a conversation in real history. So in a sense, by arguing in a circle, he's blocking himself off from knowing if this really happened.
Right. And yeah, it just seems like a really odd way to look at the Gospel of John. But again, Spong has a lot of odd ideas. But what about some of the more middle of the road or even conservative scholars who say that, John is just so different than the Synoptics. And so it's like Craig Evans, I think he even said in his debate with Bart Ehrman that me and Dr. Ehrman would pretty much agree on a lot. And it's a different genre than the Synoptics. And so is John really a different genre than, Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
No, absolutely not. He presents himself as being at least as, I mean, they all present themselves as being historical, but John is insistent. I mean, for example, at the cross, he says, after Jesus' side has been pierced and the blood and water comes out, he who saw it bore record and his record is true, and he knows that he says what is true. I think what a person like Dr. Evans is trying to avoid is what I call the Johannine dilemma, and that's in my my last, like my concluding section of the book. And that dilemma is when you have somebody who presents what he's doing as historical, and he puts all these details, and this happened in this place and time, and this is how many gallons it was, and all this stuff. And his own audience would have had no way of telling that he wasn't intending it to be historical. Then you really only have two options. You know, either he is telling the truth, or he's running a hoax. You know, I mean, if you want to say, you know, that he's making up scenes that did not happen, and in a historically recognizable way, and putting them in his gospel in this extremely serious way, then that's a hoax. And that's not something that Dr. Evans would want to do. So the word genre it's a cop-out. It's a way of saying, well, now it's not really a hoax because that's our modern whatever. But actually, he's the one being anachronistic. In fact, I have an article that was just recently accepted. I don't know when they were going to actually bring it out, but by Conspectus, which is the journal of the South African Theological Seminary, on John's Gospel. And oh wait, it's actually the other one that I've just had accepted by a journal called the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism. That was it, where I talk about the patristic reception of the Gospels and how they, like, you've got Papias talking about the truth, and I wanted to know what Jesus, the truth himself, actually said, and all this stuff. You've got these very ancient church fathers who are clearly taking the Gospels to have literal meaning, and that in itself shows that this whole idea that they're not intended to be taken literally, it's our own imposition back upon them in an attempt to kind of give ourselves an out if a scholar doesn't want to take it literally, but he also doesn't want to say that the author was a liar.
So follow up on that. Is this genre that they're suggesting John was that something that even really existed? I mean, John is just so colorful and so detailed. And I know, like C.S. Lewis has said, like if you think that this is supposedly like they anticipated this whole modern genre of historical, you know, I'm probably butchering the quote, fiction. Yeah, like they anticipated that. He's like, that didn't come along for years later, and anybody who sees this hasn't learned to read. And so Is right. That accurate of Lewis to say that?
It is accurate. And there's several things I want to say about this here. It's kind of interesting to realize that the authors who invoke genre, the scholars who invoke genre, don't even all invoke the same genre. And that should make our little antennae twitch just to begin with. So here's Dr. Evans. He's out there. He'll say it's wisdom literature, and that Jesus in certain passages looks like Lady Wisdom, and he doesn't look like a historical character. He looks like an allegorical character, and so he's invoking, that's a Jewish genre, right? So he compares it to like wisdom cries out in the streets in Proverbs. There's that passage. Well, one thing I say in the book is it's really interesting because wisdom never has anybody say, you know, who is this? We know her father and mother, right. You know, but like that happens to Jesus in some of these I am the bread of life. I am the bread that came down from heaven. They're offended, you know, because they're like, we know who his father and mother are. How can he say I came down from heaven? You know, it's a funny thing that never happens to Lady Wisdom. So he looks like exactly the opposite of an allegorical character. So in that voice, you know, Dr. Evans invokes a Jewish genre of wisdom literature. Well, no, it doesn't look like that. Second, he'll invoke what he calls Crea, and I've got a whole discussion of that in The Mirror or the Mask, my other book. And that's all very invented. There wasn't some kind of genre of Crea that was like history, but it wasn't really history, etc. That's something they're reading into these exercise books. I discussed that in the recently accepted article as well. The exercise books don't actually teach that. Well, that's Greek. Okay.
Right.
And then along comes Dr. Michael Licona, and he'll say it was Greco-Roman bioi. And they were allowed to change things, and it was like a movie based on true events or whatever. So it's like really interesting. You've got three different so-called genres, and some of them are not even from the same culture, but somehow they all have the consequence that it could look like history, but not really be history. Isn't that a funny thing? And so I think this should start making us realize that actually that's their predetermined conclusion. And then they're just going to talk about something and call it a genre to try to like shoehorn in that conclusion that it looks like history, but it isn't really history. And then that way they can say that the authors made some things up. Now, as you were pointing out, hyper realistic fiction did not exist at the time. And I saw you had a commentator when you were talking about this a while back, who was like, they had fiction. And then he talks about this Caliroe novel, and like you go read that thing, it's super purple, it's over the top, it's not hyper realistic at all. It's not at all like the Gospel of John. I mean, they had fiction, but it was kind of crappy. I mean, if you get into, really light, really kind of dorky fiction, I mean, I guess that's okay, but they didn't have the hyper realistic fiction that we even have today, which often does bring in like the autobiographical material of the author so he can make it look more realistic. They didn't have that. Moreover, if we had a modern writer who did that and tried to present it as being historical in the way that John does, then it would still be a hoax.
Right.
Even if it is a hyper realistic novel, it says a novel right on the front, which John is not doing. So we'd still have that dilemma going on. So the genre thing just doesn't work to do what they want it to do. And they've been unable to establish that kind of author audience understanding that you need for a claim of genre, where the audience is, listening to John being read in the church on Sunday and is kind of saying to themselves, well, I'm sure some of this stuff was made up, but it's really okay. Like the evidence is all to the contrary.
Right. Yeah, it just seems like a very unintuitive way of reading it, and it's just like it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, that's for sure. And so I think one of the things that these scholars will say is, well, John is so different because it has these really big long monologues. Jesus is just kind of going on forever. Sometimes you read like John chapter 8 and it's just like he's talking about a lot of times his divine identity, and he's just kind of going back and forth with the Pharisees, and I guess that would be more of a dialogue, but there's just kind of these long arguments or these long things of Jesus kind of going on and on, like John 14 through 17 is very long. And really, when we read the synoptics, we read like parables and pithy sayings and just things that are probably easy to memorize. And so does this imply that John was just kind of using Jesus as his own personal mouthpiece to promote his pet doctrine of a very high Christology? Because that's one of the things that we hear.
Sure. So I've got a chapter called The Myth of Monologuing Jesus in the book. And one of the things that's unique about my book is that I spend so much time on several of those claims about Jesus sounding different in John. I mean, I've got 3 or 4 chapters, depending on how you count them, on this topic of how Jesus sounds. As far as Jesus talking for longer, it's actually Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus appears to speak longer uninterrupted than he does in the Gospel of John. And that's not always recognized, that it's not actually true that Jesus is appearing to speak for longer uninterrupted in John than in the synoptics. So Matthew gets the prize for that. Sometimes the confusion there arises from, as you were sort of walking into, the use of the term discourse in John for a dialogue, but then they don't do that in the synoptics. So like I give examples of places where Jesus goes back and forth with the Pharisees in the synoptics, and nobody comes along and calls that a discourse. And so it's kind of gerrymandered. It's this gerrymandered category. Now, it is true that the style is more choppy in the synoptics. And sometimes the idea will be, well, so it would be easier to remember these little bits of it, and then they could just string those together and make it look like a single continuous sermon, but they were remembered separately, like as separate sayings, and that would be easier. And Jesus is more, I might call, connected. His when he talks, he speaks in a more connected way with his ideas in John. But if we stop to think about it, is that more or less realistic? Richard Bauckham has a really interesting article that I cite in the book where he says, actually, Jesus wouldn't really have taught in such a choppy way as what we find in the synoptics. I mean, that, you'd have like transitions and connecting material and so forth. So in a sense, John's reports of what he said are more realistic. Now, Bauckham doesn't conclude from that they're more accurate. In fact, he says, well, this would require putting words into Jesus' mouth. I don't agree with that conclusion. I think his argument that it's more realistic shows more than he himself realizes. One thing I think we don't realize is that it doesn't take as long to say these things as we think. On the Last Supper night, Jesus must have said much more than what John records. You can like read aloud, because I've done it. I think it's John 14 through 16, even including what the disciples say and stuff, in like 25 minutes without rushing. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to put several things together here. First of all, the concept of recognizable paraphrase. So I'm not abusing the concept of paraphrase. I talk about that in the book as well. I really mean just an ordinary concept of paraphrase, that you don't have his exact words, but you do have an accurate representation that you could have recognized if you were there of what he said on a real historical occasion. Mm-hmm. So start with that concept. And then the notion of early review. And I think this is really important. I'm not saying, and I don't think anybody should be saying, that John literally sat around with his mouth shut for 40 years or 60 years or whatever, and then suddenly said, I'm going to write in my old age, I'm going to write a gospel. And gather around, folks, because this is the first time I'm going to tell you what Jesus said on the night in which he was betrayed.
Right.
No, he would have been reviewing it. He would have been kind of reminding himself. People talk about oral tradition as a way of other people learning early on what Jesus said. They don't say enough, I think, about oral tradition and preaching as a way for the guy himself who's doing it to review and to remind himself. So suppose John was doing that from early on. Yeah. And then let's attribute to him a somewhat remarkable memory. It doesn't need to be supernatural. It doesn't need to be like one of these savants or something, but just a somewhat extra good memory. And then look at the realism of the style, that it's actually a very believable style, more realistic in some ways than the boiled down things in the synoptics. And I think we could have these being very accurate, recognizable portrayals of what Jesus said on real occasions.
Wow. Yeah. I haven't really thought of it that way, but that does make a lot of sense. I've been at the same church for 20 years. I've heard a lot of the same stories from my pastor over and over, to where almost I can quote them verbatim, Right. And so, yeah, no, that's definitely makes sense. That's an interesting way of looking at it. And so, well, let's dig a little bit into the authorship of John, because obviously if John wasn't written by one of Jesus's disciples, it would certainly be less reliable than if it was. And that is kind of one of the complaints that we often hear is, well, John is anonymous. All the Gospels are anonymous. And so how do we know it really was John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel according to John?
Right. Well, and you're right. They will say that about all the Gospels. And now Luke ends up being very reliable, even though he wasn't a disciple. But it does put another kind of, if someone isn't a disciple, it puts another remove in between him and the original events, right? If the person wasn't a disciple at all, he had to get his stuff from other people. So there is some possible slippage there. So I would start by talking about, how do we know that it was written by a disciple, a personal disciple of Jesus, the beloved disciple? And that is so unanimous. I can't even, I guess I shouldn't, that's not grammatical. So unanimous. Anyway, that is ultra well attested. Let's put it that way. All of the external evidence says that this was written by a disciple of Jesus. In fact, one of the earliest references to John, a disciple of Jesus who wrote this book is by Ptolemy the Gnostic in the mid 100s. That's pretty early. That may be
Wow.
our earliest attestation to authorship. The Gnostics were using this gospel themselves, and it's kind of interesting that then the Orthodox Christians also accepted it. They might have kind of preferred not to have to deal with it, but because the Gnostics were abusing it, but it was so widely attested they couldn't, do that. So Ptolemy the Gnostic in a letter to Flora, and also by Irenaeus, is also quoted by Irenaeus. Like, he and Irenaeus, the Christian, they agree that John, the disciple of Jesus, wrote this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find this over and over again. Irenaeus, the Anti-Marcionite prologue, the Muratorian canon, just on and on and on, to the point where, then when you get on into the somewhat later centuries and you have Eusebius actually says there is no disagreement
Mm-hmm.
about who wrote this. Okay. And our only record of anybody who thought to the contrary is an indirect record from an author named Epiphanius, who claims that there was an obscure sect named that he calls the Eloge. They didn't call themselves that. He says it to mock them, who said that it was not written by John, and that it was written by Cerinthus. But they appear to have been in this like extreme minority, and nobody listened to them. And so I talk about that, but it's just like there was within the Orthodox Christian Church, there was never any doubt. Now, as far as his being the son of Zebedee, as some of your viewers may know, Richard Bauckham, who's a very influential current New Testament scholar, has brought back this idea that it was written by a different guy named John, who also was a disciple of Jesus. So he has like a lot of the same properties as John, the son of Zebedee. He was the beloved disciple. He sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper. He witnessed the crucifixion, etc. And his name was John, but it was just a different John, whom he calls John the Elder.
Mm-hmm.
As far as reliability, that probably wouldn't make a whole lot of difference except to the Galilean ministry, because Bauckham tries to say that he wasn't present in the Galilean ministry and got that secondhand, and I respond to that. But also, Bauckham has to do an awful lot of roundabout work, and I spend my appendix of the book replying to that. But you can hold a very strong conservative view and hold that it was written by this other John. I think many of the church fathers will say it was John the Apostle. And so what Bauckham has to do is kind of wangle on that term, the apostle. I mean, why would they bother to say, John the Apostle, if they didn't mean the son of Zebedee? Well, he'll say, well, apostle could mean more than one thing. Well, in that case, their audience would be confused. I mean, if there were two guys who could both be called John the Apostle, why didn't they say more to clarify which one it was? They seem to think they already have clarified, So that's just some of how we know. The external evidence, in my opinion, is just absolutely overwhelming for both of those theses, and all the more so that it was written by a disciple named John.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of internal evidence too, wouldn't you say so? Because I know like B.F. Westcott has like a really good, like, he just kind of narrows it down. It's like, well, obviously the author was Jewish because there's so much references to Judaism, and then he just kind of whittles it down further from that. Is any of do you use any of that kind of line of argument in the book? I've read part.
I do, but what I try to do is I try to kind of separate the argument for reliability from the argument for authorship, and yet they're entangled, so it's not possible to separate them completely. And as an epistemologist, I'm like, how am I going to sort this, right? So, I use tons of that B.F. Westcott material, and Lightfoot as well, but I more often will use it to argue for reliability. And then as an argument for reliability, it is in and of itself an argument that the author was an eyewitness and that he was there and that therefore he was one of the disciples, but it's by that route. I do some as far as specifically for the son of Zebedee. So just to give you one internal example, the beloved disciple is with the others, with 6 others in John 21, where Peter says, I'm going to go fishing, and they go all night. Okay. And now the other John theory, he's from Jerusalem. He's not a fisherman. He's, he tends to hang out in Jerusalem. He's only up in Galilee because Jesus told him to go to Galilee after his resurrection. He's not there because he's from there, and so forth. But somehow, when Peter says, "Hey guys, let's go fishing," the beloved disciple is among those that says,
Right.
"Yeah, let's go."
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. Let's go stay up all night. They don't know that they're going to see Jesus the next morning.
Right.
They have no idea. They're just going fishing to go fishing. Well,
Hmm.
if you were a landlubber from the upper classes who spent most of your time living in Jerusalem, and you're only up here with these other guys because you're hoping to see Jesus, and Peter, the scruffy Galilean fisherman, says, "Hey guys, want to go out all night fishing in my boat?" Are you going to say, "Sure, sounds like lots of fun. Maybe you just did it to get a different experience"? But that's an example of internal evidence that I actually think does point specifically to the son of Zebedee, even beyond pointing to reliability.
Right. No, that's good. I haven't actually thought of that, but that does make a lot of sense. The city boy's probably not going to want to spend all night on the water, just to get some other kind of weird experience. And so it makes a lot more sense. Also, I've noticed it seems like, I think it was Peter J. Williams that brings out that the Gospel of John, when he's talking about all these different various locations, he actually brings out bodies of water more than any of the other synoptics. So just gonna toss that little nugget in there.
Yeah,
So,
and there's the specificity where he says they rowed about this many stadia when Jesus came walking to them over the water. And you're in the middle of a storm. I mean, who's going to really notice how many stadia you've rowed?
yeah.
It's been a lot. We're tired. Okay,
Yeah.
but he's got more specificity to it.
So one objection to the son of Zebedee being the author of this gospel is that Acts tells us he was an uneducated fisherman. And John, if you read it, seems to me at least to be somewhat of a literary masterpiece, and it's written in Greek. And so a lot of people will say that kind of stretches believability. What do you say in response to that?
Well, first of all, the term uneducated there should that they use for that, it should not be taken to mean illiterate, like that they could not read or write necessarily. It's that they did not have that particular rabbinic education, that they were looking for. And also, by the way, something I've been working on recently is the snobbery against Galileans. And they had a very distinctive accent, and they would make fun of their accent the way that we make fun of certain accents, like hillbilly accents or whatever. And we know that Peter had an especially strong Galilean accent that gets mentioned in the synoptics. And so they're hearing this, and it's like imagine, I don't know, some famous judge and some guy in a really hick accent is quoting the Federalist Papers to him, and it's like, how does this guy know, what he's talking about, etc. It's a very snobbish comment that they're making, and that they're thinking of it's their perception of them. Luke is not necessarily sharing that perception when he reports it. But as far as a literary masterpiece, something that's not, I think, often fully understood is that the Greek of John is actually pretty simple Greek. And that's part of what makes it distinctive. And in fact, it's sometimes used as an argument that John is changing Jesus' words, because when Jesus speaks, he speaks in this same relatively simple Greek. So, for example, he keeps using this one connective and kai over and over and over again. Whereas a more educated Greek writer like Luke, for example, he uses a wider variety of connectives and subordinating clauses and sentence types and so forth. John it's more of a choppy, simple Greek. So in that sense, it's not a literary masterpiece. Okay, so we need to recognize that. Now, do I necessarily think that he put pen to paper and wrote it down? He might have had a scribe, but that doesn't have to mean a highly rhetorically trained scribe. That could just mean that it was common to dictate. But it appears to have preserved his distinctive voice very, very clearly there. And I think he also, learned from Jesus. I think he was young, and Jesus had a big influence on the way that he spoke. So I think it's entirely plausible. And I think sometimes we mistake theological depth for literary sophistication, even hyper sophistication. He had a lot of theological depth, but that doesn't require that you be an extremely literary kind of thinker or writer. And I actually think in many ways he's kind of a literal thinker and writer.
Right. No, that makes sense. I've heard people say similar things. Obviously, Shakespeare is much of a different writer, but he only had a grammar school education, and so he couldn't have wrote these things. People have said that, and I find this objection similar-ish in a way because it just smacks of snobbery. I think you touched on that, and so all right. Well, one of the things in John's gospel is there's nothing regarding his calling. There's no mention of his brother James. Um, and there's nothing about Jesus praying in Gethsemane with Peter, James, and John. And so, wouldn't we expect these events if John was really the author to be
I
in
don't
that gospel?
think so because they're covered so well in the synoptics. That's something you look at and you go, well, I mean, did he have to repeat them? He could read them. He go, yeah, that's basically what happened. And he's only got X amount of space. So
Hmm.
he wants, for the most part, to tell different things. The feeding of the 5,000 and, of course, Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection. But even there, with the resurrection, he's telling like the story of Mary Magdalene, which isn't found in the synoptics. So he more often seems to want to add things that they didn't tell, maybe because they didn't tell them.
Right. And I feel like that's consistent with some of the patristic evidence as well. You even have, I think, Clement of Alexandria saying that like he was specifically asked to kind of like fill in some of the other details. We already have these other gospels. Like, tell us more.
Eusebius says that
Yeah.
specifically, and I can't remember. I don't think Eusebius cites his source as to who he got that from or where he got that from, but it fits with what we find, I think.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. Well, I'm going to throw just one more objection on authorship here. Bart Ehrman, every skeptic's favorite, unless you're a Jesus mythicist. So he talks about the healing of the blind man, the guy who got kicked out of the synagogue. I'll just quote what he has to say. He says there's an anachronism here. He says that the verse in John 9:22, where the man is kicked out of the synagogue after he's healed, and he gets into this big argument, and it says that it has, from a socio-historical perspective, we know that there was no official policy against accepting Jesus or anyone else as the Messiah during his lifetime. On the other hand, some Jewish synagogues evidently did begin to exclude members who believed in Jesus' messiahship way towards the end of the first century. And so the story of Jesus healing the blind man reflects their experience of a later community that stood behind the fourth gospel. These believers in Jesus would have been expelled from the Jewish community, presumably with their friends and family and neighbors. And so he's basically saying that this is just an anachronism. The writers of John are just kind of doing the whole Sitzim Leben. I hope I didn't butcher that's how that's said. But and so is that so? I mean, it just seems kind of, I don't know.
Well, I have a video, and I hope you'll link it below. Yeah. And it's called "What's a Blessing for the Heretics?" And that's what he's referring to. According to the story, and I don't see any reason to disagree with this. This is a Talmudic source there. Was a time when they added to the liturgy, and this was toward the end of the first century, this prayer that was a curse. And it was like, let the Nazarenes and the heretics be cursed and so forth. And it goes on and on and on. This is really, really mean curse. And the idea is that you would pick somebody to be a reader for the day, and if he is himself a Christian or a heretic, he's going to kind of stumble when he reads that, and you're going to smoke him out, and then you're going to kick him out. Okay, and so then that's sometimes called the blessing for the heretics, like this ironic blessing, and that's what Bart is talking about here. And here's a funny thing to realize just to begin with. The story in John 9 doesn't look like that at all, does it? And there's no prayer. They don't tell the blind man to, hey, read this. Can you read this, or say this? And if you'll say this, we'll know you're not really a follower. Or no curse, no nothing. Okay? It's just saying that the religious leaders had said that if anyone believed on Jesus as the Messiah, he'd be thrown out of the synagogue. And then obviously the blind man isn't, so they kick him out. That's not the same kind of thing at all. And so when Bart says we know that there was no policy against this, in the sense in which John's gospel describes it, we don't know anything of the kind.
Right.
We don't know anything like that. I think we can conjecture pretty clearly that this specific, curse thing was only inserted into the Jewish liturgy later, but that's clearly not what John is talking about. And there's nothing implausible about what John relates there at all. These are the same leaders who get Jesus crucified just a few chapters later. These are the same leaders who in Acts, they drag Peter and John and they say, don't preach in this man's name anymore, and they beat them. These are the same ones who are worrying elsewhere in John, which makes sense that the Romans, if a messianic movement gets going, the Romans are going to come and crush them, which could have been a real worry. So they don't want, when is it that they wanted to crush that messianic movement? During Jesus' lifetime, right? Like that's when they're worried that it's going to call negative attention to them and so forth. So it's a completely plausible scenario that they would use ostracism, which is what this is, to try to crush this incipient messianic movement. Nothing improbable about it. And Barth is just bluffing when he says, we know that there was no such. What he's doing is, well, we know that this thing didn't happen till later, and now I'm going to just assume that John is trying to refer to this thing, so John must be wrong. Well, that's exactly what you have to prove to us, because on the face of it, John isn't referring to that thing at all.
Yeah, and I seem to remember Jesus had a heck of a time in his own hometown synagogue too. So
exactly,
right.
Yeah, they could be hot-headed, but as far as an official policy, no one's saying that they sent messengers to Rome saying, don't confess that Jesus is the Christ. They didn't have to worry about Christians in Rome. There were no Christians in Rome yet. Right. Okay, so it's not in that sense an empire-wide type thing. It's just they're trying to squelch it here in Nazareth and Judea, which is where it's happening.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. It does seem like Barth is bluffing, which is a Barth kind of move. So, as usual. So, well, I'm going to move on to just a couple more things here. I'm just going to throw some contradictions at you here, supposed contradictions in John's gospel. The cleansing of the temple, that's everybody's favorite, you know. Did the gospel writer, did John decide to creatively move it to the beginning of Jesus' ministry? Were there two cleansings? You know, like, why is it at the beginning in John's gospel? What's going on there?
So I argue that there were two, and I have a series on my YouTube channel about this, as well as discussing it in The Eye of the Beholder. But if people prefer, you know, YouTube, they can watch it on there. So I don't think there's any problem with there being two, and I just think John is reporting one, and the synoptics are reporting the other one. And you know, the events are similar, but they're not uncannily similar. I mean, there's an article that I cite by Chappell, Alan Chappell, where he says, you know, cleansing 1 or 2, and he has a chart and he shows differences, you know, little differences of the way it happened. Now, if we had reason to think they were the same event, we could harmonize those. But when we have reason already to believe that they're different events, then those serve to answer the statement, oh, this is just like so uncannily similar, like they're all saying exactly the same thing and doing exactly the same thing. It's not like that. They're not. They're about as similar as two similar types of events, like two different abortion clinic protests or something at the same clinic, where you're holding a same sign from the same organization or something, but that could easily really happen. So I don't see a problem there at all. And I think the arguments against two cleansings are really weak, and I answer those. They're what I call a priori history, like the statement, they would not have let him keep living for 3 more years if he cleansed the temple that early. I mean, how do you know that? You know, I mean, he's brand new. He's brand new on the scene. He's just come on the scene. They're taking their time. Even the religious leaders don't become murderous instantaneously. You know, even they take a while to decide to be the villains of the piece and kill him, you know. So it's really, I think, very weak to say this would not have happened twice.
Right. And so, yeah, I think so too. It just seems like it's like we're kind of deciding ahead of time that this has to be some kind of doublet or whatever people want to call it. That's probably not the right phrasing, but yeah, that makes sense. And so another thing, this is a real common one with John. Where is Lazarus in the synoptics? I mean, this is what motivated the chief priests to kill this guy. They're like, they wanted to kill Lazarus after he was raised from the dead, because it's like, the Romans are going to take our nation from him. Everybody's following this guy because this great miracle happened. But then in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we get crickets about Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that imply that John was just kind of making stuff up just to make Jesus look more amazing
and powerful or whatever? Well, one thing I think we need to realize is that people can certainly be motivated by more than one thing. I mean, if you picture the Lazarus incident is upsetting them, then you go to the synoptics, and one of the things they say was upsetting was the parable of the wicked tenants, where he says the kingdom will be taken from you and given to others, and it's like they sought to destroy him. So they're like, they're motivated by that. The triumphal entry, which is recorded in all 4 Gospels, was certainly Hosanna. Blessed to the Son, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. So this is king language. This is messianic language, which if they're worried about Rome, they're going to be worried about that from the triumphal entry as well. So there's all kinds of things that motivated them, and they've been wanting to get him for a while. Even as far back as John 7, they send the temple police to try to arrest him back then. So it's not just one thing; it's not either or. And then why is the raising of Lazarus not recorded in the synoptics? That's something where I think we really have to get a grip on how poor the argument from silence is in such cases. If I have 2 family members and they both drive on the road and they come home, and one of them is talking to me and says, I saw this accident at this intersection, and then the other one would have driven past the same intersection and doesn't happen to mention the accident to me. It's not like, I don't believe that the accident happened, because I'm insisting everything has to be told twice. There's no principle in history that everything has to be told twice. Yeah. And so sometimes we just don't know why somebody doesn't mention something. How many married couples have had a thing, why didn't you tell me that this thing happened? And any married couple has had this happen. The wife will say it to the husband sometimes. Husband will say it to the wife sometimes. Why didn't you tell me? And they'll go, I didn't think of it. And sometimes it's really true. They just didn't decide. They just decided not to tell them. So, and it doesn't have to be some, hiding or suppression or anything. So I have a phrase for this. I call it the randomness of saliency. So saliency is what jumps out at you, what you notice, or what you want to tell. And in history, we've got to get to grips with the randomness of saliency, that we don't always have to have an explanation. And a lot of times we're not going to have an explanation for why an author didn't tell something, but that doesn't make it historically legit to discount another author who has all kinds of argument for his accuracy just because they didn't both tell it. That's not a good argument.
Right, for sure. I mean, and going back to the argument of silence too, I mean, Marco Polo didn't even mention the Great Wall of China or tea, which seems kind of like a big deal. So,
Marco, did you notice something?
Yeah. And so, you just see so many cases.
I give several examples like that in the book about like Ulysses S. Grant not mentioning the Declaration, the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. That seems like might be a big deal. So, okay. Well, I've thrown a lot of objections at you. I want to kind of talk more about the case for John. Some people say, and this I guess is kind of an objection, but it leads into, I think, the strong positive case that we can make, is that they say, well, Jesus sounds so different than he does in the synoptics. But you say that Jesus sounds a lot like the same Jesus in the synoptics, and there's this really great unity of character. And so can you get into some of that for me a little bit?
Sure, and I hope you'll link your own video below. Yeah. Don't be too modest to do that. You did an excellent video on that recently in which you summarized some of these. So there are a lot of these similarities. Some of them are actual sayings that are similar, like servant is not above his master, which we actually find twice in John, and then we also find in the synoptics, but in different contexts. Or asking you shall receive, which we find in different contexts. So sometimes they're actually very similar sayings, and it's the same guy, using, that's how he talked, that's what he said. But then one that I really like is an example of his way of thinking. And I have a lot of these different things, his way of thinking or his personality. And one of these concerns Sabbath controversies.
Mhm.
So you talk about this in the video where in Luke, he heals this woman who's been bent over for 18 years, and then they're kind of the ruler of the synagogue is annoyed because he healed on the Sabbath and tells the people, come to be healed on the other 6 days. And Jesus said, well, you will lead an animal to water on the Sabbath, and you will untie the animal, lead it to water. And should I not have untied and loosed this woman whom Satan has bound for 18 years? So it's like loosing and loosing. It's a very rabbinic way of talking to show their double standard, their lack of a sense of perspective, their hypocrisy. And then he does something similar over in John, but it's a completely different miracle where he heals the crippled man in John 5. And they're annoyed because he tells the man to take up his bed and walk, which is carrying on the Sabbath. Plus, he healed him on the Sabbath. And then in John 7, he says, I did one work and you all marveled. You will circumcise a man on the Sabbath day that the law be not broken. And I made a whole man well on the Sabbath, and then you hate me and you oppose me. So, and that really is, by the way, a rabbinic ruling. We actually have rabbinic discussions of this, that if a baby boy's 8th day fell on the Sabbath, it was not considered work to do the circumcision. And so Jesus is like, oh, that's not considered work. But for when you're circumcising, cutting off, but I'm making a man whole, and that's considered illicit work. That doesn't make sense. And something that did not make it into the book, I literally just noticed it yesterday when I was trying to do some research for a new popular level book I hope to write if I'm able. It's in Matthew 23:23, and he's saying, woe, you Pharisees. So it's the woes to the Pharisees. He's really, really getting down on them. And he says, you tithe your mint and dill and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law. So mint and dill and cumin, they don't weigh much at all. They're these little, it's like you're counting your dill seeds, or you're putting them in a little itty bitty scale to decide how much is a tenth or whatever, so you can tithe them. But you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, which is righteousness and justice and mercy. And so this, light versus weighty, it's the same way of thinking, also about a Sabbath controversy, or not a Sabbath controversy, but a tithing controversy in this case, but that lack of a sense of perspective, and he's using light versus heavy to make his point. So I love those kinds of things that show that similarity of character and even of ways of speaking.
Yeah, and frankly, I like it that Jesus is sarcastic. And so I think sometimes when we see Jesus as, to me, when I read that chapter, it wasn't just like really good information on the reliability of the Gospels. I'm just thinking like, this would actually preach on a Sunday,
Oh, yeah.
And you just see Jesus as a person and just what he was like. And I think sometimes when you see that, it kind of frees you up, because we get this kind of weird picture of Jesus as this like kind of two-dimensional, very ultra spiritual character but here Jesus makes jokes. He gets sarcastic with people that are, irritating him in just these different things.
He's sad.
Yeah, he's sad. He gets lonely.
Yep.
He there's a very human side, and I just thought that was really good. And especially in John, we're told that there's this very developed picture of John, and he's just like this otherworldly, and it's not exactly really what we follow at all. On the cross, he's like, I'm thirsty. Like, that's probably the more human side of Jesus we see in any of the other passion stories. So,
yeah. Or Jesus wept, that he weeps at the grave of Lazarus,
Yep.
And it even has this word, he was troubled, I think is how it's usually translated. It actually means he snorted. It's like, the grave, so it's like really, really vivid and empirical that we have in John.
Yeah. So getting into that, one of my favorite chapters in the book is the John the man who saw, and you get into a lot of these details, and we kind of touched on a little bit earlier with authorship, that there's just so many odd little details that look like personal reminiscences. What are some of those, and how do those apply to the reliability issue.
So there's just a ton, way more than I could give here, and a lot of them have to do with locations. Some of those are externally confirmed, and some of those we haven't found the locations, and yet it's very clear that John has something specific in mind. So for like Bethany near Jerusalem, we can confirm it was 15 furlongs from Jerusalem, and we have a traditional location, and it's really about that far. But then John also refers to a Bethany beyond Jordan, and we don't know where that was for sure, but he knows there were two of them and that he had to distinguish them, if he was going to speak of them. So that's the kind of thing, that accuracy, but also that vividness of sight. So I talk about this with Mary Magdalene. Now, he wouldn't have been there, but I think he probably got it from her, where he loves physical movement, so it's like she turns and looks into the tomb, and then Jesus speaks and she turns around, and it says she turned back, and so we have her like turning back, and John is describing that in great detail. Or the disciples running to the grave, and the beloved disciple outruns, but then he doesn't go in, but then Peter comes and then he goes in, and then the beloved disciple goes in, and it's like very, very specific. Or when Jesus washes their feet, it's like he took off his outer garment, and he girded himself, and he filled a basin, and he washed their feet. Or when Judas goes out, he says, and it was night.
Yeah.
And there's like, there probably weren't windows. So it was only when he went out that he saw that it was night. Mm-hmm. And so he's got, I think of John as very empirical. And I think we have a false notion that if you're very theological, you're not very empirical. And I don't think that's true. I think a person can be very into deep theology, but also very into, sensory things and the things of the flesh, and have a very vivid mind and a very vivid memory. And I think John was one of those people.
Yeah. One of those I noticed not that long ago. I don't know if it was in the book, and but it goes out of, John goes out of his way to say that when Peter was warming himself by the fire, before he denies him, he says it was a charcoal fire. And I'm just like, that's just such a weird detail to throw in there. Like
specifically.
Right. There's just so many of those things. And so I do have a video. I will put a card up for those that touches more into that argument, and definitely get the book, because to me that was probably my favorite chapter. So, well, I think we could pretty much wrap up here. Like I said, get the book. It is the book on the reliability of John, as far as I'm concerned. And one thing, Lydia, that I hear a lot, and this, I guess, irritates me, but people will say, well, Dr. McGrew, she's a philosopher. Come on, she's not a biblical scholar. Why should I listen to her versus Craig Evans or Bart Ehrman or whoever, and so what do you say when people kind of get into this credentialism thing with you?
Yeah, that kind of bothers me too. Well, I have several things to say. One is that, credentialed scholars don't all agree with each other either. Mm-hmm. D.A. Carson doesn't agree with Craig Evans. I'm not saying they've ever argued over this specifically, but you read Carson's commentary on John and you'll get a very, very different picture. Craig Blomberg doesn't agree with Craig Evans. Okay. No. So you're going to have to make up your own mind eventually anyway. You're not just going to be able to hang on to credentials. What are you going to do? Go eeny, meeny, miny, mo to pick which credentialed scholar to follow? So you're going to have to make a decision anyway. So you might as well look at the arguments. If you are going to be concerned about credentials and you're thinking of dismissing me, that's one thing that endorsements are good for. My endorsers don't all have to agree with everything I say. They probably don't all, though I think some of them do agree with my approach. But I have quite a lot of really high-profile endorsers whose credentials are impeccable, who are saying that this book is worth reading. Yeah. Okay, so, Stanley Porter, Craig Blomberg, Peter Williams, Randy Leedy, Jack Collins, Andrew Doss, Alan J. Thompson, William Weinrich, Edward W. Klink III, Paul N. Anderson, and here we've got a worthy contribution to the field is literally the last sentence of Paul Anderson's endorsement. And so these guys, Thomas Schreiner,
Yeah.
just names that you will have heard of. And these guys are saying, no, you need to pay attention to this. So, if somebody thinks it's worth dismissing, don't bother reading it. Who cares? Because she's not credentialed. Take it up. I would say take that much at least up with my endorsers. I'm not going to saddle them with every proposition I defend, but the value of the book and the worthwhile nature of the book, I think, is something that those endorsements do tend to support. But more importantly, it's the arguments that matter. So let's get into those and let's really, duke it out and see who has the better of the arguments.
Well, absolutely. I would definitely say, from what I've read, obviously I'm a little biased here, but I think you definitely have the better of the arguments. One of the things that I tell people a lot of times is look, her background is in epistemology. If anything biblical scholarship needs right now is somebody who knows a little bit about probability theory and epistemology. This is kind of important stuff, because you see, the Spong quote that we started with a conversation with, just some wild stuff. A lot of these guys can't agree even who the historical Jesus is. Was he a wise sage? Was he just, some kind of religious zealot? Was he, apocalyptic prophet that failed? And they can't even come together on something as simple as that. And then, I don't know, for me, just when I studied just the arguments over who wrote the pastoral epistles, I'm like, guys, these arguments against this are just really bad. And it just kind of just did away with credentialism for me. And so,
and I show where credentialed scholars make, outright errors. I mean, for example, Dr. Evans said that there are 7 I am discourses in the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. And I go into that in detail in the book. There are not 7 things that even could be called I am discourses in the Gospel of John. It's just a blunder, or he says that I am the light of the world. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And then he goes on and on and on for many verses. That's not true. So, credentialed scholars can be wrong. So
absolutely
it's important.
Absolutely. Just look at the arguments on the merits themselves. And so, well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I do want to plug your YouTube channel. You have mentioned different things in our conversation. I will put cards up for those, to people can get to those videos. But the YouTube channel is Lydia McGrew. You post every Sunday pretty much.
That's what I'm trying to do right now. Yeah.
Yep. Videos are excellent. Your last video on what you think about the synoptic problem was just amazing. I thought it was extremely helpful and answered some of those criticisms that sometimes you hear on the internet that just have no basis in reality. Mm-hmm. And so I would definitely point people to the books, but also be sure to check out and subscribe to her channel. Click the bell for notifications, because you are going to get a lot of really, really good nuggets from these videos, just chock full of really good information. Your whole series on the Christmas narratives was terrific. And so if you like my channel, you will love her channel, because she gets so many more details. So go check it out. And so thank you again, Lydia, for joining me. And I really appreciate you coming on the show and let me grill you with these questions.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. It's been fun.